Welcome to our fourth lecture. This one is on the mind-body problem, which this will be a relatively short lecture because it's going to be an introduction really to some of the other things that we're going to be looking at in terms of trying to understand the way in which the field of behavioral neuroscience approaches fundamental questions that have plagued the field of psychology for a very long period of time. So this again will be a relatively brief lecture, but it'll be one that will be important because it really lays the groundwork for some of the other things that we're going to be talking about in future lectures. So the mind-body problem has a very interesting history. Biological explanations for behavior. That's what we're really interested in studying in this course in behavioral neuroscience. So it really requires a little bit of understanding of this thing called the mind-body or mind-brain problem. And again, this has been something that's been a part of the field of the study of behavior for really for quite a lengthy period of time. It's really only of historical interest now, as you will see, but nonetheless, it does play an important role in the field of behavioral neuroscience. So if we go back in history, if we go back in the history of psychology, the mind-brain problem, or the study of the relationship between the mind and the brain, really got its start with the philosopher Rene Descartes, with what is called dualism. Descartes and other philosophers at that time believed that the mind really was a non-physical substance. And if you take a look at what Descartes was saying, he identified that the mind, with consciousness and being self-aware. And again, that very famous statement that you see there, very famous quote from Descartes saying, "I think, therefore I am." And so in other words, what he's saying is that the mind and body are distinct from one another, but they are closely joined at the same time. So if you take a look then at what he's saying in this dualism or interactionism, the pineal gland plays an important role in Descartes' theory. And if you take a look at the pineal gland in this figure that you see here, the pineal gland that he talks about, he believed that that was the seat of the soul. That's really where all of our thoughts are being formed. And again, this was a very common belief at this time. It was one that was advanced by a number of different philosophers. But it is something that is rejected today by neuroscientists. And again, these are questions that are really more of historical interest. But it's important to take a look at a little bit of this background. Another philosopher comes along in the 18th century by the name of de la Mettrie, and he writes a book which is called Man the Machine. And like Descartes, he really denies the existence of the soul as something that's being separate from matter. And he argues that mental processes are really caused by the body. So he believes that the body, bodily reactions, for example, and mental illness, he believed that they were associated with one another. So now, as we're advancing along, we're getting a view that, our behavior is really not separate at all from our biology. Along then comes another philosopher by the name of Christian Wolff, who advances the idea of what he calls monism. The universe is really consists of only one type of substance, and there are different forms of monism that were advanced by Wolff and by others, one called materialism, that is, everything that exists is physical by its nature. Mentalism, meaning only the mind truly exists, and then what is called the identity position, on which philosophers were saying that mental processes are really identical to brain processes. We're simply describing them in different ways. So I think we're getting, closer to this viewpoint than all the time, that really our mind is really a part of our biology. Another, important development here is by way of this anatomist, 18th century anatomist by the name of Franz Gall, and he advanced what is called phrenology. And essentially what he was saying in this approach is that if we take a look at the convolutions of the skull, there are faculties of the mind that are revealed by way of these contours that we can look at. And again, if you take a look at this map, if you will, that anatomist like Franz Gall developed, he believed that cautiousness existed here. He believed that secretiveness existed here. He believed that love of life was in this part of the cortex of the brain. Sensual love was in this area. Love of praise existed here. Love of beauty existed here. I think you get the picture. There are these different faculties which he believed were inborn, that existed that could be identified in these contours that you see here of the skull. And he believed that these faculties could be developed and could enlarge and really take on a more prominent role in terms of our behavior. So again, it's the kind of approach that's saying if you use these various faculties, they're going to be strengthened. Now, phrenology had enormous popular appeal during this period of time, especially in France and in Germany. And again, this was an approach that was advanced by these anatomists. But when they started classifying individuals, large numbers of individuals, I mean, they believed that you could identify a very cautious person if these convolutions of the cortex became enlarged. So once they started taking a look at individuals with these bumps in various parts of their brain, and trying to relate them to those behaviors that were thought to exist beneath them, it was found that there was essentially no relationship whatsoever. So again, this was something that was pretty much debunked shortly after Franz Gall had advanced this theory, and then various philosophers and scientists went out to try to prove it, and they simply couldn't. And again, this was by way of collecting a lot of information on many different individuals, taking a look at these convolutions of the skull and whether or not these faculties had really been highly developed in those individuals. So again, no relationship whatsoever. These mind-brain relationships that we talk about, in which we're trying to explain the degree to which our behavior is a product of our biology. We have different explanations. Why is consciousness a property of brain activity? What kind of brain activity produces consciousness? How does brain activity produce consciousness? The mind-brain or mind-body problem really is only of historical interest today. Scientists, of course, today believe that, our behavior, our mind, our soul, if you will, is really a product of our biology. So the mind-brain relationship, it's really important that we also talk about this idea that we call solipsism. Because we can't really observe whether or not another individual is conscious, we only really know about our own consciousness. Only I exist. You are an illusion. I can't tell whether or not you are conscious. And indeed, if we take a look at this, this idea, this approach that's called solipsism, is essentially saying that I alone am conscious. I can't determine whether or not you are conscious. So again, this is the difficulty of knowing about consciousness in another person. And this is something that I want you to think about. I want you to think about it in the context of, trying to convince, for example, a person who's a solipsist that you are conscious. That's, I think, one of the thought questions that we have in this area that I want you to do some thinking about, how you would go about actually trying to prove to a solipsist that you are conscious. So give that some thought. So the mind-brain relationship, Chalmers, a few years back, 1995, proposes really that there are two problems that we have to try to address in the field of psychology and behavioral neuroscience. There are those problems that he calls easy problems and those problems that are called hard problems. There's been a lot of research that's been done in the field of behavioral neuroscience in which we've taken a look at the behavior of an individual and then their particular conscious state in terms of their underlying biology. And if you take a look at that figure that you see there, if we were taking a look at brain activity as reflected by these different colors that you see here, here's high brain activity in an individual that's fully conscious. Here's a minimally conscious state, and here's a vegetative state. Can we say when we see this that our biology really is causing consciousness? Well, we can't. We can say that these things are correlated with one another. That we take a look at metabolic activity of the brain, that a person who's fully conscious has very high metabolic activity. But if you take a look at a person who's in a vegetative state, they don't show that same level of metabolic activity. But is that low metabolic activity causing that vegetative state? See, that's something that we don't really know. So it's really easy to take a look at metabolic state of the brain and correlate it with behavior. It's really easy to take a look at different neurotransmitters in the brain and hormones in the brain and enzymes in the brain and correlate it with a conscious state that an individual is in, maybe a cognitive state, maybe how much they're thinking or or their memory processing or decision making. But it doesn't mean that those changes that you see in the biology of the brain are causing those behavioral changes. So that's the area that I think that we're in right now in the field of behavioral neuroscience, these hard problems, causality, how and why does brain activity, influence consciousness? Those are answers to those questions are the ones that are really important. Those are ones that we don't really have a lot of great answers for at this point. So again, this is meant by way of an introduction for some of the other things that we're going to be talking about in the next few lectures. So hopefully now you have a pretty good grasp of what we mean by the mind-brain relationship and some of the history behind it and where we're at right now in terms of understanding, these easy kinds of relationships versus which are correlations versus trying to understand causality. So again, this is an introduction for some of the other things that we're going to talk about. So again, in our next lecture, we'll be pursuing some of these issues a little bit more thoroughly in terms of where we're at right now in the field of behavioral neuroscience.